On a hot summer day, a boy falls into the pool and his life is saved by a fragile girl. Despite her weakened health, she risks everything to rescue him, defying her limitations. The millionaire, moved by her courage, promises to cover her medical expenses and give her a new life. If you enjoyed this beautiful story of love and overcoming adversity, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and let us know what city you're watching from. And now, the rest of the story. The July sun beat down on Greenwich, Connecticut, one of the most affluent suburbs in the New York metro area, where mansions rose like fortresses of concrete and glass, protected by high walls and electronic gates. On Magnolia Lane, the Miller residence stood out among all the others. 3 stories of pure luxury, a heated pool, a tennis court, and a garden that looked like it, was torn from the pages of a design magazine. Here the sound of money echoed in every corner, from the Italian marble floors to the crystal chandeliers imported from Europe. It was a summer Saturday, the kind where the heat seems to melt the asphalt and makes anyone dream of a cold plunge. Inside the mansion, the hustle and bustle was constant. Patricia Miller, an elegant 42-year-old woman with impeccably styled blonde hair and a perpetual manicure, was organizing a party for her son Raphael and his little friends from private school. They were children from wealthy families, accustomed to parties with themed decorations, full catering, and giant inflatable bounce houses. Raphael was 7 years old and the joy of the house, a boy with light brown hair, green eyes like his father's, and a wide smile that could win anyone over. He ran around the pool area with his friends, shouting, laughing, and throwing a ball, completely immersed in the carelessness of childhood. To him, the world was that immense garden, the crystal blue water of the pool, those toys that never seemed to end. Edward Miller, the family patriarch, was in his office even on a Saturday. He was a businessman, a real estate developer who erected commercial skyscrapers all over the city. Tall, broad-shouldered, with graying hair at the temples that gave him an air of authority, Edward was known for his seriousness and determination. He had built his empire from scratch, coming from a middle-class family in upstate New York, and now he breathed success from every pore. But success had its price. Edward spent little time with his family, always buried in contracts, meetings, and business trips. While the party was happening outside at the back of the property, near the shed for tools and gardening supplies, a 9-year-old girl rested in the shade of a large oak tree. Isabella was slender, almost too fragile for her age. Her dark brown hair was tied back in a simple ponytail, and her olive skin glistened with sweat from the heat. She wore a faded cotton dress, already a bit too small, but it still fit. Her eyes, however, were what drew the most attention. Large, dark, and deep, they carried a maturity that didn't match her 9 years. They were the eyes of someone who had already seen pain up close. Isabella was the daughter of Joe, the mansion's groundskeeper. Joe had worked for the Millers for almost 10 years. He was a humble man with calloused hands and a huge heart. A widower since Isabella was only 3, he raised his daughter alone, juggling his work at the mansion and caring for the little girl. Isabella's mother had passed away far too soon, taken by complications no one in the family liked to talk about. Since then, Joe did everything he could to ensure Isabella had a decent, if modest, life. The problem was Isabella wasn't like other children. Since she was little, she had a complicated health condition. The doctors at the community clinic in their neighborhood in Queens had explained to Joe that the girl had a congenital heart defect, something related to her heart not developing properly. On top of that, her lungs were weak, and any major physical exertion left her breathless. Isabella's life was a cycle of doctor's appointments, expensive medications that Joe could barely afford, and sporadic hospital stays when things got worse. But there, on that July afternoon, Isabella was trying to rest. Joe had brought her to work because he had no one to leave her with. The neighbor who usually watched her on weekends was out of town, and he couldn't miss a day. Edward Miller was a fair boss, but also a demanding one. Joe didn't want to risk his job, so he brought his daughter, asking her to stay quiet in the shade, away from the party's commotion. Isabella could hear the children's laughter in the distance. She closed her eyes and imagined what it would be like to be there, playing, running, diving into the cool water. But she knew she couldn't. Her body wouldn't allow it, any major effort, and her heart would race. Her breath would fail and she'd have to sit down and wait for it to pass. So she stayed there invisible, just watching life happen for others. On the other side of the garden, the party was in full swing. Raphael was beaming, surrounded by friends. They were playing with a ball, chasing each other, and the racket was constant. Patricia watched from a distance, sitting on a lounge chair, sipping fresh squeezed juice while talking on the phone with a friend. She wore large sunglasses, the kind that hid half her face, and seemed more focused on her conversation than on the children. The housekeepers, 2 women in impeccable uniforms, served snacks and juice to the little guests. Joe was busy checking the pool's filtration system, which had shown a small problem that morning. He worked discreetly, almost invisibly, as always. To the people who frequented that house, Joe was just another employee, someone who kept everything running perfectly behind the scenes. That's when it happened. Raphael, overly excited by the game, ran after the ball that had rolled toward the deep end of the pool. He was barefoot and the deck around the pool was wet and slippery. The other children were yelling something, but the noise was so loud that no one understood what. Raphael didn't realize he was going too fast. He tried to stop, but his feet slipped out from under him. The boy lost his balance and, in a sudden motion, fell head-first into the water. It all happened in seconds. Raphael went under hard, hitting his head on the side of the pool before sinking. The water swallowed the boy like a hungry mouth. He struggled, but he couldn't get back up. His small arms flailed frantically, but Raphael didn't know how to swim well. He was in the deep end, where his feet couldn't touch the bottom. Panic took over. He tried to scream, but only swallowed water. His lungs burned. The world around him began to go dark. The other children started screaming. It took the nearest adults a few seconds to understand what was happening. Patricia dropped her phone and jumped up, pulling off her sunglasses. She screamed her son's name, but she was too far away. Joe dropped his tools and ran, but he was also at a distance. Time seemed to crawl, each second an eternity. It was Isabella who saw it all first. She was far away, but the sound of the children's screams made her open her eyes. She stood up, leaning on the trunk of the oak tree, and saw what was happening. Her heart raced, not from her illness, but from fear. She saw the boy sinking, saw the adults running, but still far off. She knew there was no time. Isabella didn't think. She just acted. Her fragile body launched into motion, her thin legs running faster than she had ever run before. Her heart beat erratically, her lungs burned, but she didn't stop. She reached the edge of the pool and without hesitation jumped into the water. The impact was brutal on her weakened body. The cold water enveloped her, heavy, suffocating. Isabella knew how to swim. Her father had taught her when she was younger, in better days, when her health still allowed it. But it had been years since she'd been in a pool, a river, anywhere. Now her muscles protested, her heart screamed for mercy. But she swam. She swam with all the strength she didn't have. Raphael was sinking, his movements growing weaker. Isabella dove down, reaching him. Her lungs begged for air, but she held her breath. She grabbed the boy's arm and pulled with all the force she could muster. Raphael was bigger and heavier than her, but Isabella didn't give up. She kicked her legs, rising, until finally their heads broke the surface of the water. Isabella pulled Raphael toward the edge, but her strength was fading fast. Her heart was racing in a way she had never felt before. Her vision started to blur, black spots dancing before her eyes. She managed to push Raphael until he touched the side, but then her legs gave out. She simply had no energy left. Her body began to sink. Joe reached the edge of the pool the exact moment he saw Isabella go under. His heart nearly stopped. He screamed his daughter's name and jumped into the water without taking off his boots, without taking off anything. He swam to her, grabbed her by the waist and pulled her up. Isabella was unconscious, pale, her lips turning blue. Edward had heard the screams and run out of his office. He reached the pool area and saw the scene. Raphael was being pulled from the water by one of the housekeepers, coughing and vomiting water, but alive. Patricia knelt beside her son, crying hysterically, but Edward saw Joe, saw the groundskeeper pulling a little girl from the water, a girl he barely knew existed. Joe laid Isabella on the ground next to the pool. She wasn't breathing. Her chest was still. Desperate, Joe began CPR. He had learned it years ago, in a free course offered by the city, but he never imagined he'd have to use it on his own daughter. His hands trembled as he pressed on the girl's fragile chest. He counted mentally. 30 compressions, 2 breaths, 30 compressions, 2 breaths. Edward approached, watching everything. He saw the dedication of that man, saw the desperation in Joe's eyes, and something inside him stirred. He knelt beside Joe and said in a firm voice that he was calling a private ambulance the best that money could buy. Isabella finally coughed. Water gushed from her mouth and she began to breathe, weakly, irregularly, but breathing. Joe turned her on her side, helping her expel the liquid from her lungs. Isabella opened her eyes, confused, scared. She saw her father's face, saw the tears streaming down his cheeks, and tried to speak but couldn't. Her whole body ached. Her heart was beating strangely as if it were skipping beats. The ambulance arrived in less than 15 minutes. Paramedics rushed out with a stretcher, equipment, everything. But when they tried to take Isabella, Joe stopped them. He looked at Edward and said he didn't have health insurance, that he had no money to pay for a private ambulance, that he would take his daughter to the local clinic. Edward looked at that man, at that desperate father, and something inside him broke. He held Joe's arm and said, in a firm voice, that he would take care of everything. He said that Isabella would go to the best hospital in New York, would have the best doctors, the best treatment, and that he, Edward Miller, would pay every single cent. Joe looked at Edward, not understanding. He hadn't saved Raphael. His daughter had. Isabella, that fragile, sick little girl, had been the hero. She had risked her own life, knowing she might not survive, to save a boy she barely knew. Patricia, still kneeling beside Raphael, looked at Isabella for the first time. She saw the pale, wet, trembling girl. She saw the faded dress, the bare feet, the extreme thinness, and then she understood. That girl, that invisible child, had saved her son. Patricia stood up and walked over to Joe and Isabella. She knelt beside them and took Isabella's hand, squeezing it tightly, and whispered a thank you that came out broken, full of emotion. Isabella was taken to the hospital. Joe went with her, holding his daughter's hand the whole time. Edward and Patricia followed in another car, taking Raphael. The boy was fine, just scared, but he insisted on going to the hospital to see the girl. He wanted to thank her. He wanted to say that he was alive because of her. At the hospital, Isabella was taken straight to the ICU. The doctors ran tests, connected her to monitors, administered medication. Edward spoke with the specialists, authorizing everything. He said the cost didn't matter, that they should do whatever was necessary. Joe, sitting in the waiting room, couldn't stop crying. He didn't know if it was from relief that she was alive or fear of what might still happen. Hours passed. Night fell over New York and the city lights came on. Inside the hospital, in the ICU, Isabella finally opened her eyes. She was connected to wires and tubes, but she was alive. A nurse smiled at her and said she was okay, that she was very brave. Isabella didn't feel brave. She felt tired, so very tired. Joe was allowed into the ICU for a few minutes. He held his daughter's hand and cried again. He told her she had done something incredible, that she had saved a life, but that she should never risk herself like that again. Isabella, in a weak voice, said she hadn't thought about it. She just saw the boy sinking and knew she had to do something. Edward and Patricia waited outside. Raphael was with them, sitting in a chair, swinging his legs. He was quiet, a rarity for him. He stared at the ICU doors, wanting to go in, wanting to see the girl. Patricia tried to distract him, but Raphael didn't want distractions. He wanted to see Isabella. When Joe came out of the ICU, Edward approached him. He put a hand on the groundskeeper's shoulder and said they needed to talk. Joe, exhausted, just nodded. Edward led him to a private room, away from the others. There he looked directly into Joe's eyes and made a promise. He said that from that day on, he would cover all of Isabella's medical costs, not just for that hospital stay, but for everything she would ever need. Appointments, tests, medications, surgeries, everything. Joe tried to protest, said he couldn't accept, but Edward cut him off. He said it wasn't charity, it was gratitude. Isabella had saved Raphael. She had given him his son's life back. There wasn't enough money in the world to pay for that. Edward continued. He said that Joe and Isabella no longer needed to live in the small apartment in Queens. He had a guest house on the property, a house that was previously used by another employee. It was a simple but comfortable house, with 2 bedrooms, a living room, a kitchen, and a bathroom. Joe and Isabella could live there, rent-free, for as long as they wanted. Joe would work as usual, but now he would have his daughter close, safe, in a better environment. Joe couldn't speak. The words simply wouldn't come out. He looked at Edward and saw for the first time not the millionaire boss, but a grateful father. He extended his hand and the 2 men shook. In that handshake, a silent agreement was sealed. More than that, a mutual respect was born. In the following days, Isabella began to recover. The doctors were impressed with her resilience. Despite her fragility, she had a strong spirit. They adjusted her medications, ran new tests, and discussed long-term treatment options. Edward authorized everything, without batting an eye. He visited Isabella every day, bringing Raphael with him. The boy would sit by the girl's bed, talking, telling stories, trying to make her smile. Isabella gradually opened up. She was a shy girl, used to being invisible, but Raphael had a way of making her feel seen. He told her she was a hero, that she was the bravest person he knew. Isabella would blush, look away, but inside, something was changing. For the first time, she felt important. For the first time, she felt valued. Patricia visited too. She brought fruit, juices, things Isabella liked. She talked with Joe, asked about his life, about the wife he had lost. She realized there was a whole world beyond the walls of her mansion, a world of people who fought every day just to survive. She felt ashamed for never having noticed before. When Isabella was finally discharged, a small celebration was organized. It was nothing big, just the Miller family and Joe with Isabella. They gathered in the mansion's living room and Edward made a toast. He said that this was a new beginning for everyone, that Isabella and Joe were now part of that house in a different way. They were no longer just an employee and his daughter. They were family. Joe and Isabella moved into the guest house on the property the following week. It was a new world for both of them. The house had large windows that let the sun in, a small yard where Joe planted some flowers, and a room for Isabella that was bigger than the entire living room of their old apartment. Isabella couldn't believe it. She walked through the house, touching the walls, feeling the texture of the curtains, marveling at every detail. Raphael visited Isabella every day. He brought toys, books, games. He wanted her to feel welcome, to know she had a friend. Isabella at first was reserved. She wasn't used to attention, to gifts, to someone wanting to be near her. But Raphael was persistent. He had a pure heart and he genuinely cared about her. The months passed and a new routine was established. Joe continued to work as the groundskeeper, but now with a different kind of peace. He knew Isabella was safe, well cared for, with access to proper medical treatment. Isabella started attending the same private school as Raphael. Edward insisted on it, saying she deserved the best education. At first, Isabella felt out of place. The other children came from rich families, wore designer clothes, talked about international trips. But over time, she found her place. She was smart, dedicated, and the teachers quickly noticed her potential. Raphael became her biggest defender. Whenever someone asked an awkward question or looked at Isabella strangely, Raphael was there, standing up for her. He would say she was his best friend, that she had saved his life, that she was the most incredible person he knew. And Isabella slowly gained confidence. She realized she could be more than the sick girl. She could be a student, a friend, a part of something bigger. Edward changed too. He started spending more time at home, having dinner with the family, talking with Patricia and Raphael. He realized his fortune meant nothing if he didn't have time to enjoy life with the people he loved. He continued to work, but now with more balance. He also started to look at Joe differently, no longer as an employee, but as a man worthy of respect, someone who had raised an incredible daughter on his own. Patricia, for her part, began to get involved in volunteer work. She realized there were many children like Isabella, children who needed medical help, but whose families lacked the resources. She started working with a non-profit that helped low-income families access healthcare. It was a way of giving back, of honoring what Isabella had done. But life, as always, was not as simple as it seemed. There were tensions that no one mentioned. There were secrets that had not yet come to light. And as everyone adapted to this new reality, something was about to change again. Something none of them expected. Something that would test all the bonds that had been formed on that hot July day, when a fragile girl proved that courage has nothing to do with physical strength, but with the strength of the heart. 10 years had passed since that day at the pool, 10 years that had completely transformed the lives of everyone involved in that story. New York City was still the same frenetic metropolis, with its skyscrapers touching the sky, its chaotic traffic and its glaring inequalities. But inside the Miller Mansion in Greenwich, a small private universe had formed, with its own rules, its own secrets, and its own tensions. Isabella was now 19. The fragile, sick girl of the past had transformed into a young woman of quiet but striking beauty. Her dark, brown hair fell in soft waves over her shoulders, framing a face with delicate features. Her eyes remained her most impressive feature, large and deep, but now they carried not just maturity, but also a wisdom gained through overcoming adversity. Isabella still had her heart condition, but with the proper treatment Edward provided, she was able to lead a relatively normal life. She took daily medication, had regular checkups, and avoided extreme physical exertion, but she was alive, studying, dreaming. She was in her second year of an education major at Columbia University. She had been accepted with an impressive SAT score, the result of years of dedication to her studies. Isabella had discovered her calling in education. She wanted to work with children, to make a difference in the lives of little ones who, like she once was, were invisible to the world. Every morning she took the train into the city, even though Edward had offered a car and driver. Isabella insisted on maintaining a certain independence, on not getting completely comfortable in this world of privilege that was not originally hers. Raphael was 17 and in his senior year of high school. The mischievous, cheerful boy had become a tall young man, broad-shouldered like his father, but with a sensitivity that Edward never had. Raphael was handsome, with the same piercing green eyes and light brown hair that fell slightly over his forehead. He was popular at school, captain of the football team, liked by everyone. But his favorite person in the whole world was Isabella. She always had been. Since that day at the pool, Raphael carried a gratitude and affection for Isabella that transcended normal friendship. She was his confidant, his best friend, his inspiration. Joe continued to work as the mansion's groundskeeper. Now 58, he had more grey hair than brown, and the wrinkles around his eyes told of years of hard work and worry. But he was a happy man. Seeing Isabella healthy, studying at one of the best universities in the country, was more than he had ever dared to dream. Joe had a respectful relationship with Edward, but also a genuine friendship. They talked about football on Sundays, had a beer together sometimes, shared life stories. The employer-employee barrier still existed, but it had become much thinner over the years. Edward, at 54, was still the successful businessman he had always been. His development company had grown even larger, now with projects not just in New York but in other major cities across the country. But that day at the pool had changed something fundamental in him. Edward had learned to value what truly mattered. He still worked hard, but he always made time for his family. Dinners together were sacred, weekends were reserved for being at home. He had also developed a philanthropic side, investing in social projects, especially those related to children's health. Patricia was 52 and still the elegant woman she had always been, but she had changed, too. Volunteering had become an essential part of her life. She chaired the board of the non-profit that helped low-income families with medical treatment, dedicating several hours a week to the project. Patricia had found a purpose, something that filled her in a way that social parties and lunches with friends never could. But on that Monday morning in March, something was different in the air at the mansion. There was a subtle tension, something unsaid that hung over everyone. Isabella had woken up early, as always, and was having coffee in the kitchen of the small guest house where she lived with her father. Joe had already left to start his work, checking the gardens and the pool area. Isabella wore jeans and a simple blouse, her hair in a ponytail. She was drinking tea and reviewing her notes from class when she heard a knock on the door. It was Raphael. He looked different, with a serious expression that didn't suit him. Raphael was usually all smiles and energy in the morning, but that day his green eyes seemed heavy with worry. Isabella invited him in, offered him coffee, but Raphael refused. He sat down at the kitchen table, running his hands through his hair several times, a nervous gesture Isabella knew well. Isabella sat across from him and asked what was wrong. Raphael looked at her, hesitated, and then let it all out at once. He said he needed to tell her something no one else knew, something that was suffocating him. Isabella took his hand, encouraging him to speak. Raphael took a deep breath and confessed that he was in love, deeply, desperately in love, and it was destroying him inside, because the person he was in love with was someone he couldn't have. Isabella felt a tightness in her chest. She asked who it was, and Raphael looked directly into her eyes. He didn't have to say it. Isabella saw it there in that intense green gaze, a truth that left her breathless. It was her. Raphael was in love with her. Isabella dropped his hand as if she'd been burned. She stood up from the chair, moved away, leaning her hands on the kitchen sink. Her heart, that fragile heart that had almost killed her once, was beating erratically. Raphael stood up too and started talking quickly, desperately. He said he knew it was wrong, that he knew she probably saw him only as a brother, that he knew the age difference, the difference in their worlds. Everything conspired against them, but he couldn't pretend anymore. He had tried for years to ignore what he felt, had dated other girls, had tried to convince himself it would pass. But it didn't. It only got worse. Every time he saw Isabella, every time they talked, every time she smiled, he fell more in love. Isabella turned to him, and Raphael saw tears streaming down her face. She said he couldn't be serious, that this wasn't love, it was gratitude, it was confusion. She had saved his life years ago, and maybe he was confusing his feelings. Raphael vehemently denied it. He said he knew the difference between gratitude and love, and what he felt for Isabella was love. A love that had grown with them, that had matured, that had become something impossible to ignore. Isabella shook her head, the tears increasing. She said it couldn't happen, that it was impossible for 1,000 reasons. First, because they were practically siblings, they had grown up together in the same house. Second, because she was the employee's daughter and he was the boss's son. Third, because she didn't want to destroy everything they had built over the years, all the family harmony. And fourth, and perhaps most importantly, because she couldn't return his feelings. Raphael took a step back as if he'd been punched. He asked if she was sure, if she had never felt anything more than friendship for him. Isabella hesitated. She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. The truth was, she didn't know. There had been moments over the years when she caught herself looking at Raphael differently. There had been moments when his touch made her skin tingle. There had been moments when she found herself jealous of his girlfriends, but she always pushed those feelings to the back of her mind, refusing to acknowledge them. But now, confronted with Raphael's confession, Isabella could no longer run. She looked at him, at this young man she had watched grow up, who had always been by her side, who had always defended her, who had always made her feel special. And she realized, with a frightening clarity, that she loved him too. Not like a brother. She loved him in a way that scared her, that made her feel things she had never felt for anyone. But even acknowledging this to herself, Isabella knew she couldn't admit it. Not to Raphael, not to anyone. There were bigger things at stake. There was Joe, who owed everything to the Millers. There were Edward and Patricia, who had been so generous to her. There was the peace and harmony that everyone had worked so hard to build. Isabella couldn't be the one to destroy all of that for selfish feelings. So she lied. She looked into Raphael's eyes and said in the firmest voice she could manage that she felt nothing but sisterly affection for him, that he would always be her best friend, her brother at heart, but nothing more. Raphael looked at her for a long moment, and Isabella saw something break inside him. He nodded, without saying a word, and left the house, closing the door behind him with a soft click that sounded like a gunshot in the silence. Isabella collapsed into the chair and cried like she hadn't cried in years. She cried for the lie she had just told, for the pain she had caused Raphael, for the impossibility of the situation. She cried because, for the first time, she understood what it was to have a broken heart. And ironically, it wasn't an illness that broke it, but love. The following days were tense. Raphael avoided Isabella, and when they did cross paths, he barely looked in her direction. Isabella missed him in a way that hurt physically. She found herself looking for him every time she was near the main house. She found herself wanting to text him, wanting to tell him she had lied, that she did feel it, that she loved him too. But she held back. She always held back. Joe noticed something was wrong. He knew his daughter too well not to. One night, after dinner, he asked if everything was okay. Isabella, tired of lying, tired of pretending, broke down. She told her father everything. Raphael's confession, her own confused feelings, the lie she had told, the pain she felt. Joe listened in silence. When Isabella finished, he held her hands and said something she didn't expect. He said he understood her confusion, but that she shouldn't make decisions based on fear. Isabella protested, saying it wasn't fear, it was consideration. It was respect. Joe shook his head. He said he had known Edward and Patricia for years, and he knew they weren't petty people. If Isabella and Raphael truly loved each other, and if that love was real and respectful, Joe saw no reason why they shouldn't give it a chance. Isabella was shocked. She expected her father to be horrified, to tell her she was being absurd. But Joe, in his simple wisdom, saw things differently. He said life was too short to waste true love. He said he had lost Isabella's mother too soon, and he regretted every moment he hadn't spent by her side. He didn't want Isabella to have the same regrets. But Isabella was still afraid. Afraid of Edward and Patricia's reaction, afraid of Joe losing his job, afraid of everything falling apart. Joe saw his daughter's fear and said he would talk to Edward, that he would try to test the waters, see how his boss might react to the idea. Isabella stopped him, desperate. She said no, that it was better to leave things as they were, that in time Raphael would get over it and everything would go back to normal. But things didn't go back to normal. Raphael started going out more, coming home late, getting involved with groups of friends that worried Patricia. He was clearly trying to forget, trying to fill the void with distractions. Edward noticed the change in his son and tried to talk to him, but Raphael shut down, saying everything was fine, that it was just stress from the upcoming college entrance exams. Patricia, more observant, began to suspect something. She noticed how Raphael avoided Isabella, how he would leave a room when she entered. She also noticed how Isabella seemed sad, distant, lost in thought. One afternoon, Patricia invited Isabella for tea, something they did occasionally. They sat on the mansion's veranda, overlooking the blooming garden. Patricia started the conversation casually, asking about college, about Isabella's plans. But then she changed her tone and asked directly if something was going on between her and Raphael. Isabella almost dropped her teacup. She tried to deny it, but Patricia interrupted her. She said she wasn't blind, that she could feel the tension between them, and that she wanted to help. Isabella, feeling she could no longer run, told her everything. Raphael's confession, her own feelings, her fear of the consequences. Patricia listened attentively without interrupting. When Isabella finished, expecting disapproval or anger, Patricia did something unexpected. She smiled, a sad but understanding smile. Patricia said that ever since Isabella saved Raphael that day 10 years ago, she knew that girl was special. She said she had watched Isabella grow up, seen her become an incredible, intelligent, kind and strong woman. She said that if her son had to fall in love with someone, she couldn't have chosen a better person than Isabella. Patricia saw no problem with their love. The only thing that mattered was that they were both happy. Isabella started crying again. She said she was afraid Edward wouldn't feel the same way, that she was afraid Joe would lose everything. Patricia took her hand and promised she would talk to Edward, that she would prepare him. She said Edward was a fair man and that deep down he also had a special affection for Isabella. Patricia was sure he would understand. That night, Patricia spoke with Edward. She told him about her conversation with Isabella, about the feelings between her and Raphael. Edward was silent for a long time, processing the information. His first reaction was surprise, but not anger. He thought about Raphael, how the boy had grown up alongside Isabella, how they were inseparable. He thought about Isabella, the brave girl who saved his son, the determined young woman she had become. Edward told Patricia he needed to think, that it was a delicate situation, but deep in his heart he already knew what his answer would be. Isabella had proven, over the years, that she was a person of character, worth more than any fortune. If Raphael loved her and she loved him, who was he to stand in their way? Edward was only concerned about one thing, the difference in age and maturity. Raphael was still 17, still heading to college. Isabella was already in university, with a more defined life. Edward talked to Patricia about his concerns. She agreed there were practical issues to consider, but said they shouldn't forbid anything. Instead, they should talk openly with Raphael and Isabella, put everything on the table, discuss how they would handle the situation. Edward agreed. The next day he called Joe in for a talk. Joe entered Edward's office with his heart pounding. He didn't know what it was about, but he sensed it was serious. Edward invited him to sit and got straight to the point. He said he knew about the feelings between Raphael and Isabella, and he wanted to know Joe's opinion on the matter. Joe took a deep breath. He said that, as a father, he only wanted his daughter's happiness, that Isabella was a responsible, mature young woman, and he trusted her judgment. If she loved Raphael, and Raphael loved her, Joe would not object. But he also shared Edward's concern about their ages, and the difference in their worlds. Edward nodded, satisfied with the answer. He said he saw no problem with their love, but he thought it was important for them to go slow, not to rush things. Raphael still had to finish high school, get into college, decide his future. Isabella was still in college, building her career. There was time for everything, and true love would wait. Joe agreed completely. The two men shook hands, a tacit agreement sealed. But there was something neither of them knew yet, something that was about to complicate everything in a way no one could have predicted. Because while they were talking about the future, decisions from the past were about to come back and haunt them all, and when the truth finally came out, nothing would be the same. The family meeting took place on a Saturday afternoon in the mansion's living room. Edward and Patricia sat on the largest sofa, Joe settled into an armchair, and Raphael and Isabella sat side by side on the smaller sofa, both visibly nervous. The tension in the air was palpable, as if everyone was walking on eggshells, afraid of saying the wrong thing. Edward began to speak, his voice deep and firm as always, but with a tone of kindness that surprised Raphael. He said that everyone there was an adult or close to it, and that they could talk openly about anything. He knew about the feelings between Raphael and Isabella, and he wanted to make it clear that he had no problem with it. Patricia nodded in agreement, smiling encouragingly at both of them. Raphael looked at his father with a mixture of surprise and relief. He had expected resistance, maybe even anger, but Edward was being understanding, human. Raphael felt a knot in his throat loosen. Isabella, beside him, clasped her hands, tightly, trying to hold back tears. Joe, from his armchair, watched with a discreet smile. Edward continued. He said he understood that the heart doesn't choose when or who to fall for, but that there were practical matters to consider. Raphael was still a minor, about to apply to college, with his whole life ahead of him to decide. Isabella was in college, focused on building a career. They should go slow, get to know each other as more than friends, but without rushing, without pressure. Patricia added that the most important thing was honesty. If they decided to date, it should be transparent, respectful, with no secrets. The whole family was there to support them, not to judge them. Isabella finally let her tears fall, but they were tears of relief. She stood up and hugged Patricia, thanking her in a choked voice. Raphael also stood up and hugged his father, murmuring a thank you that came from the bottom of his heart. But then Joe asked to speak. He cleared his throat, shifted in his armchair, and said there was something he needed to tell them. His voice had a grave, almost somber tone that made everyone look at him attentively. Joe said that before any decision was made, Raphael and Isabella needed to know a truth he had carried for years, a truth he had promised never to reveal, but now, faced with this situation, he could no longer hide. The silence that followed was heavy. Isabella looked at her father with concern. She had never seen him so serious, so burdened. Edward and Patricia exchanged confused glances. Raphael sat down again, his heart racing. Joe took a deep breath, ran his hands over his face, and began to tell a story no one expected to hear. Joe said that many years ago, when Isabella was only 3, his wife Maria was very sick. She had a severe lung condition that worsened every day. The doctors at the local clinic said she needed expensive treatment, imported medications, specialized care that Joe simply couldn't afford. He was working as a janitor in an office building at the time, earning very little. He worked overtime, took on side jobs on weekends, but it was never enough. Maria got worse every day. She had terrible shortness of breath, spent nights awake struggling to breathe. Isabella, still so little, watched it. All without understanding. Joe was desperate. He tried to get loans, asked for help from distant relatives, but nothing worked. And then, on a particularly difficult day, when Maria had a severe attack and had to be rushed to the hospital, Joe did something that haunted him to this day. He accepted money from someone. A lot of money. Enough to pay for Maria's treatment, the best doctors, the imported medications. But this money came with a condition Joe knew was wrong, but in his desperation at the time he accepted. The person who offered the money was a businessman, a rich man who had a particular interest in helping Maria. And this man had demanded absolute secrecy. Joe couldn't tell anyone where the money came from, not even Maria. Isabella was confused, trying to understand where her father was going with this. Edward and Patricia listened intently, still not grasping the relevance. Raphael was leaning forward, elbows on his knees, completely absorbed. Joe continued, his voice growing weaker, as if each word pained him. He said that Maria started the treatment and for a while she seemed to get better. The doctors were optimistic. But then something unexpected happened. Maria had an adverse reaction to one of the medications. She developed complications, her condition worsened drastically, and within weeks she was gone. Joe blamed himself to this day. If he hadn't accepted that money, if he had been more careful, maybe Maria would still be alive. But that wasn't all. Joe said that when Maria passed, he discovered something that destroyed him. He found out that the businessman who had offered the money had a hidden motive for helping. This man had known Maria years before when she was young and had been in love with her. Maria never returned his feelings, chose Joe, married him. But the businessman never forgot. And when he learned that Maria was sick, he saw an opportunity to perhaps win her over somehow, or at least be near her again. Joe discovered that the man had visited Maria in the hospital several times, always when he wasn't there. Maria, weak and confused, didn't understand his intentions. She just thought he was an old acquaintance being kind. But when Joe found out, he was furious. He confronted the man, told him he never wanted to see him again, that he would pay back the money as soon as he could. The businessman just smiled and said the money was a gift, that he expected nothing in return, but that Joe would have to carry the weight of knowing he accepted help from someone with ulterior motives. Isabella was pale. She knew none of this. She had always known her mother got sick and passed away, but she never knew the details, the circumstances. Joe looked at his daughter with tears in his eyes and apologized. He said he should have told her sooner, but he was ashamed, carried an enormous guilt. He had failed as a husband, as a father, as a man. Isabella stood up and went to her father, kneeling in front of him. She held his hands and said he hadn't failed, that he had done what anyone would do to save someone they loved. She said he was the best father in the world, that he had raised her alone, that he had fought for her every single day. Joe hugged his daughter and cried openly, something he rarely did. Raphael, Edward, and Patricia were all moved, but also confused as to why Joe had chosen this moment to reveal this story. It was then that Joe pulled away from Isabella's embrace, wiped his tears, and looked directly at Edward. He said there was more, something he had discovered years later, something that changed everything. Joe recounted that a few years after Maria's passing, He was organizing her documents, preparing to sell some things and move. That's when he found a letter Maria had written to him, but never delivered. In the letter, Maria confessed something she had discovered shortly before getting sick. She told him that when she was young, before she met Joe, she had a brief relationship with someone. A relationship that ended badly, that left her heartbroken. That person was the businessman who later offered the money. And Maria revealed in the letter that from that brief relationship, a child had been born. A daughter. A daughter she was forced to give up for adoption by her own family, who wouldn't accept her being a young, single mother. Maria was only 16 at the time. The child was adopted by a wealthy family, and Maria never saw her again. But she kept a secret about this daughter, a secret that tormented her. Joe stopped talking. The silence in the room was deafening. Isabella was frozen, trying to process what her father was saying. Edward and Patricia looked at each other, expressions of shock on their faces. Raphael was on his feet, pale, his hands shaking. It was Edward who, in a hoarse voice, asked for the businessman's name. Joe hesitated, but then he said it. The name was Albert Peterson. Patricia brought a hand to her mouth, stifling a cry. Edward closed his eyes, as if he'd been struck. Raphael looked from one to the other, not understanding. Isabella was also lost. It was Patricia who finally spoke, her voice trembling. She said that Albert Peterson was her brother, Patricia's older brother, a man who had left many years ago, cutting ties with the family, moving abroad. A man Patricia barely knew, because he was much older, and they had grown up apart. Edward added that Albert had returned to the States years ago, had tried to reconnect with Patricia, but she had refused. He was a troubled man, involved in shady business dealings, someone the family had deliberately distanced themselves from. Edward never knew the details of Albert's life, only that he was someone who brought trouble. Joe then dropped the final bombshell. He said that, according to Maria's letter, the daughter she gave up for adoption had been adopted by a family with the surname Miller, a wealthy family from the New York area. Joe had looked for information over the years discreetly, trying to understand, and everything indicated that Maria's daughter, Isabella's half-sister, was Patricia. The world seemed to stop. Patricia looked at Joe as if he had said the most absurd thing in the world. She shook her head, denying it, saying it was impossible. She knew her. Parents, her biological parents. She wasn't adopted. Joe said he understood her shock, but that there was proof. He had investigated, found documents, old records. Patricia's parents had adopted a baby girl shortly after her birth, but never told her. They raised her as if she were their biological daughter and took that secret to their graves. Edward was in shock. He looked at Patricia, trying to process it. If this was true, it meant that Patricia was the daughter of Maria, Joe's wife. It meant that Isabella and Patricia were half-sisters. It meant that Joe had raised Isabella while Maria's other daughter lived a life of luxury, unaware of her true origins. Patricia started to cry. She said it couldn't be true, that her parents would never lie to her like that. But then she started to remember small details, strange things she had noticed over the years but ignored. The lack of baby photos of her, the way her parents always avoided talking about the birth, about the pregnancy, the times she asked and they changed the subject. Small things that alone meant nothing, but together they formed a pattern. Edward said they needed concrete proof. He wasn't going to believe it based solely on a letter and Joe's amateur investigations. Joe agreed. He said he had kept Maria's letter, that he had the documents he found. He went to his house and returned with an old box. From inside, he took out a letter, yellowed with time, written in Maria's delicate handwriting. He also took out certificates, sealed adoption records, documents he had managed to obtain through contacts over the years. Edward took the documents and began to read. Patricia read over his shoulder, tears streaming down her face. The more they read, the more it all made sense. The dates matched, the names matched. There was even an old photo, a photo of a young pregnant Maria hidden among the papers. Patricia picked up the photo and looked at the young woman's face. She saw her own eyes, her own nose, her own lips. It was like looking into a mirror from the past. Raphael was stunned. He looked at Isabella, who was sitting on the floor, hugging her knees, in complete shock. He realized what this meant. If Patricia was Isabella's half-sister, it meant that Isabella was, in a way, part of the Miller family. But not a niece, not a cousin. It was something more complicated, and then Raphael understood why Joe had chosen this moment to reveal everything. Because this truth changed the dynamic of everything. Edward finally spoke, his voice tired. He said they needed to do DNA tests, confirm everything scientifically, but deep in his heart he already knew it was true. Everything fit perfectly. Patricia was Maria's daughter, Isabella was Patricia's half-sister, and Raphael, without knowing it, had fallen in love with someone who, though not related to him by blood, was connected to his family in a deep and complicated way. Patricia looked at Isabella with an expression that mixed shock, sadness, and something more. She stood up, went to where Isabella was sitting on the floor, and knelt in front of her. Patricia held Isabella's face in her hands and said, her voice choked with emotion, that if this was true, if they really were sisters, then she had finally found the family she always felt was missing. She said she had always felt out of place, as if something was wrong, as if she didn't completely belong in that world of wealth. Now she understood why. Isabella hugged Patricia, and the two women cried together. It was a cry of mourning for the mother Patricia never knew, for the sister Isabella never knew she had, for the lost time, for the lives that could have been different. But it was also a cry of discovery, of connection, of something new being born in the midst of the pain. Joe watched it all with a heavy heart. He had kept that secret for so long, thinking he was protecting Isabella, protecting Maria's memory. But now he saw that perhaps he should have told them sooner. Perhaps everyone had. The right to know the truth from the beginning. Edward put a hand on Joe's shoulder and said he understood why he had kept the secret, that he didn't blame him. They were impossible circumstances, difficult decisions. Raphael was sitting alone on the sofa, watching everything. He felt lost, as if the floor had disappeared from under his feet. He loved Isabella. That hadn't changed. But now there were so many complications, so many layers of connection between them. He no longer knew what to think, what to feel. He stood up and left the room, needing air, needing space, to process it all. Isabella saw Raphael leave and wanted to go after him, but Patricia held her back. She said Raphael needed time, that they all needed time. This revelation had shaken the foundations of everything they knew. Nothing would be the same. But maybe, with time, they could find a new balance, a new way of being a family. Edward suggested they do the DNA tests as soon as possible to confirm everything. He said he would hire the best labs, that they would have the results in a few days. Patricia agreed she needed to know for sure. Isabella also agreed, though she was still in shock. Joe just nodded, exhausted from so much emotion. The meeting ended there. Each person went to a different corner of the mansion, needing space to process. Isabella went back to the small guest house with Joe. They sat at the kitchen table in silence for long minutes. Finally, Isabella asked why her father had never told her before. Joe said he was afraid it would change everything, afraid of losing their place in that house, afraid Isabella would suffer even more. Isabella said she understood, but that she wished she had known. She said she had spent her whole life feeling like an intruder in that world of wealth, always grateful but always out of place. Now she discovered that, in a way, she belonged there. Not because Joe worked there, but because her mother had a deep connection to that family. It was strange, it was confusing, but it was also liberating in a way. That night, no one slept well at the Miller mansion. Edward and Patricia stayed up late, talking, trying to understand. Raphael stayed in his room, staring at the ceiling, thinking about Isabella, about the love he felt for her, and how everything had become even more complicated. Isabella stayed awake too, thinking about the mother she barely knew, the sister she had just discovered, the uncertain future that lay ahead. The DNA tests were done the following Monday. Patricia and Isabella went to the lab together, accompanied by Edward. The procedure was quick, painless. Just a cheek swab from each of them, and that was it. Now they had to wait. The results would arrive in a week. A week that would feel like an eternity for everyone involved. A week that would change their lives forever, confirming what Patricia's heart already knew to be true. The week of waiting for the DNA test results was one of the longest and most tense the Miller family had ever experienced. The atmosphere inside the mansion was one of restrained anticipation, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting for a confirmation that would change everything. Edward tried to focus on work, but he constantly found his mind drifting to Joe's revelation. Patricia barely left the house, cancelling social engagements and non-profit meetings, saying she didn't feel well. Raphael spent that week almost completely isolated. He went to school, came straight back to his room and barely spoke to his parents. He avoided Isabella with even more intensity than before, as if her proximity burned him. He was confused, lost in a whirlwind of emotions he couldn't organize. He loved Isabella, that was unquestionable, but now discovering that she was his mother's half-sister, that there were blood ties connecting their families in such a complex way, messed with his head in a way he didn't know how to handle. Isabella was also immersed in her own thoughts. She continued going to her classes at Columbia, but she was only physically present. Her mind constantly wandered, thinking about the mother she barely knew, the sister she had just discovered, the man she loved who now seemed more distant than ever. She felt as if she were in limbo, waiting for a truth that would either confirm or completely destroy the new reality that was forming. Joe continued to work, as always, but he carried an even heavier weight on his shoulders. He had opened Pandora's box, revealed secrets that perhaps should have remained buried. But he didn't regret it. He knew that Raphael and Isabella deserved to know the truth before making any decisions about their feelings. It would have been unfair to let them move forward without knowing the whole story. It was on a Friday afternoon that the envelope arrived. Edward was at home, working in his office, when his assistant called to say that the lab results had been delivered. Edward asked her to bring it personally, not trusting a courier with something so important. Half an hour later, the sealed envelope was in his hands. Edward held the envelope for long minutes, just looking at it. The piece of paper inside contained a truth that would completely change the family dynamic. He called for Patricia, who came down from her room immediately. He called for Raphael, who took longer but eventually appeared. Edward then called Joe, asking him and Isabella to come to the mansion. They needed to open this together. 15 minutes later, they were all gathered again in the living room, the same room where, a week ago, Joe had revealed Maria's secret. Now they were there to find out if that story was true or just a tragic coincidence of names and dates. Edward placed the envelope on the coffee table, still sealed. He looked at each person present and asked if they were all ready. One by one they nodded. It was Patricia who picked up the envelope. Her hands trembled visibly as she tore the seal. She pulled out the papers, white sheets with charts, numbers, and technical terms she barely understood. But at the bottom of the last page, there was a paragraph in bold, written clearly and directly, so that anyone could understand. Patricia read it aloud, her voice breaking with each word. The test confirmed with 99.9% certainty that she and Isabella shared a maternal link. They were, in fact, half-sisters. The silence that followed was absolute. No one moved, no one breathed. It was as if time had stopped, as if the world had frozen in that instant. And then Patricia let the papers go, and they fluttered to the floor, scattering. She covered her face with her hands and began to cry. It wasn't a silent cry, but a deep, visceral sob that came from a very deep place inside her. Isabella stood up and went to Patricia, kneeling in front of her. She took the hands of the woman she now knew to be her sister and said in a choked voice that she was there, that she was with her, that they would figure out what this meant together. Patricia hugged Isabella tightly, as if clinging to a life raft in the middle of a shipwreck. Edward watched with tears streaming down his face. He had never seen Patricia so vulnerable, so broken, but at the same time there was something beautiful about that moment. Two women, separated by life, by circumstances, by fate, finally finding each other as sisters. He stood up and hugged them both, forming a circle of affection and understanding. Raphael was sitting on the sofa, watching everything as if he were outside his own body. He saw his mother crying, saw Isabella comforting her, saw his father hugging them both, and he felt lost. He no longer knew what his place was in this story. Was Isabella now his half-aunt? No, that wasn't right. Patricia was Isabella's half-sister. There was no blood relation between him and Isabella. But still, it all felt wrong, complicated, impossible. Joe stood in the corner of the room watching in silence. He had tears in his eyes too, but not of sadness. They were tears of relief. The truth was out. The lie he had carried for so many years had finally been revealed, and the sky hadn't fallen. The family hadn't shattered. On the contrary, it seemed like a new kind of bond was forming. When everyone had calmed down a bit, Edward suggested they sit and talk. There was much to discuss, much to understand. They settled onto the sofas, Patricia holding Isabella's hand tightly, as if afraid she would disappear if she let go. Edward began by saying that this discovery was shocking, yes, but it didn't have to be destructive. They could choose how to deal with it, how to incorporate this truth into their lives. Patricia said she wanted to know more about Maria, about the mother she never knew she had. She asked Joe to tell her everything, every detail, every memory. Joe, his voice thick with emotion, began to talk about Maria. He told them how he met her at a neighborhood block party in Queens. She was the most beautiful girl he had ever seen, with a smile that could light up any room. They started dating, fell in love, married, young. Joe told them about Maria's personality. She was kind, generous, always worried about others. She worked as a seamstress, making beautiful clothes for the neighborhood. She loved to cook, especially cakes and sweets. She had a special way with children, always playing with the little ones in the neighborhood. She was everything Joe could have wished for in a wife, in a mother for his daughter. Isabella added the few memories she had. She remembered her mother's scent, a cheap floral perfume that to her was the most wonderful thing in the world. She remembered the lullabies Maria sang, to put her to sleep. She remembered the soft hands running through her hair. They were fragmented memories from a 3-year-old, but they were all Isabella had. Patricia absorbed every word, every detail, building an image in her mind of the woman who had given birth to her. She felt a deep pain for all that she had lost, for not having known Maria, for not having had the chance to call her Mom. But at the same time, she felt gratitude for finally knowing the truth, for understanding where she came from, who she was. Edward asked Joe about Albert Peterson, Patricia's brother. He wanted to better understand that man, that missing piece of the puzzle. Joe told him what he knew. Albert was a complex man, obsessed with Maria, even after she had rejected him. He had offered the money not out of kindness, but in a desperate attempt to be near her, to perhaps win her back. When Maria passed, Albert disappeared too, returning abroad, cutting ties with everyone. Patricia said she had no interest in looking for Albert. To her, he was a stranger, someone who shared her blood but not her history. She had her adoptive parents who had been wonderful, who had raised her with love and dedication. She didn't need Albert, but she needed Isabella. She looked at the young woman beside her and said that from that day on, Isabella was no longer just the groundskeeper's daughter. She was her sister, and as her sister, Patricia wanted to be present in her life, wanted to get to know her for real, wanted to build a relationship. Isabella, emotional, said she wanted that too, that for years she had felt like an outsider in that house, always grateful but never truly belonging. Now, she discovered that in a way she did belong, not because of charity, not because of gratitude, but because of blood ties. It was liberating and terrifying at the same time. It was then that Raphael finally spoke. He said he needed air, that he needed to think. He said he loved everyone there, but that he was confused, lost. He stood up and left the room, heading toward the garden. Isabella watched him go, her heart aching. She wanted to run after him, to explain that nothing had changed between them, that they were still the same people. But she knew that in fact everything had changed. Edward said they should give Raphael time. He was young, processing a lot at once. Patricia agreed, but suggested that maybe Isabella should talk to him to clear things up. Isabella hesitated, but eventually agreed. She stood up and went after Raphael. She found him sitting on the stone bench near the ornamental pond at the back of the garden. It had been their favorite spot since they were kids, where they used to sit and talk, to escape the world. Isabella approached slowly and sat down beside him, keeping a respectful distance. For a long moment neither of them spoke. It was Raphael who broke the silence. He said in a hoarse voice that he no longer knew what he felt, what he thought. Isabella wasn't his cousin, she wasn't his aunt. There was no blood relation between them. But somehow she was now even more intertwined with his family. She was his mother's sister. It was a connection Raphael didn't know how to process. Isabella said she understood his confusion, that she was confused too. But she said that one thing hadn't changed, what she felt for him. She looked at Raphael and for the first time admitted it out loud. She said she loved him, that she had lied that day in the kitchen when she said she only saw him as a friend. She had lied because she was scared of complicating things, scared of losing everything. But now, with so many truths coming to light, she could no longer lie about her own feelings. Raphael looked at her, and Isabella saw a glimmer of hope in his green eyes. He asked if she was sure, if she wasn't just saying that because she felt guilty or confused. Isabella shook her head. She said she was sure, that she knew exactly what she felt, and that, despite all the complications, despite all the revelations, she still wanted to be with him, if he still wanted to. Raphael didn't answer with words. He simply leaned in and kissed Isabella. It was a soft kiss, filled with emotion, with promise, with everything they hadn't said over the years. Isabella returned the kiss, feeling as if she were finally home, as if everything made sense. When they pulled apart, they both had tears in their eyes, but they were tears of happiness. Raphael said that no matter how complicated things were, he loved her, and that he wanted to try, wanted to give them a chance. Isabella agreed, and they sat there, hands intertwined, watching the sun begin to set over the city. It was a new beginning, full of uncertainties but also of possibilities. When they returned to the mansion, it was dark. Edward, Patricia, and Joe were in the living room, talking in low tones. When they saw Raphael and Isabella walk in holding hands, a smile formed on everyone's faces. There were no more objections, no more barriers. If these two young people loved each other, everyone there would support them. The following months were a period of adjustment. Patricia and Isabella began to build a sisterly relationship, something new for both of them. They had lunch together every week, talked about everything from fashion to philosophy. Patricia told stories of her privileged childhood. Isabella told stories of her humble one. And in every conversation, they discovered more similarities than differences. They were both strong, determined women, with a deep sense of justice and compassion. Raphael and Isabella started dating officially. They took it slow, as Edward had suggested, getting to know each other in a new way. They went out to dinner, to the movies, walked around New York. And with each date, their love grew, matured. Isabella discovered that Raphael was much more than the mischievous boy she knew. He was thoughtful, deep, with dreams and fears like anyone else. Raphael discovered that Isabella was even more incredible than he had imagined, a woman of courage and determination who inspired him to be better. Edward and Patricia changed too. They grew closer, talking more, sharing more. The revelation about Patricia's past had shaken the family, but it had also strengthened their bonds. They realized that family isn't just about blood, but about choice, about being present, about loving unconditionally. Joe continued to work as the groundskeeper, but now with a renewed sense of peace. He had done the right thing by revealing the truth, even if it was late. He saw his daughter happy, healthy, loved. It was all he could ever wish for. But life, as always, had more surprises in store. One afternoon, Edward received a call in his office. It was from a lawyer representing Albert Peterson. Albert was back in the country, and he wanted to meet Patricia. He had found out through his own means about the DNA tests about Isabella, and he wanted to be part of the story. Edward was furious. He told the lawyer that Patricia had no interest in seeing Albert, that the man had caused enough pain. But the lawyer insisted, saying that Albert was different, that he had changed, that he wanted to make peace. Edward hung up the phone angrily, but he knew he couldn't hide this from Patricia. She had the right to know. That night during dinner, Edward told them about the call. Patricia turned pale. She said she didn't want to see Albert, that he was a ghost from the past who should stay there. Isabella agreed, saying that man had manipulated her mother, had used her illness for selfish ends. They owed him nothing. But Raphael said something that made everyone pause and think. He said that maybe they should hear what Albert had to say, not for him, but for themselves, to close that chapter, to fully understand the story. Patricia hesitated, but after much thought she agreed. She would arrange a meeting with Albert, but on neutral ground, in a public cafe with Edward by her side. She would hear what he had to say, but she wouldn't promise anything. The meeting was set for the following week, and as that week approached, everyone in the Miller family prepared to confront the last ghost of the past, the man who had started this whole chain of events so many years ago. The meeting with Albert promised to be revealing, potentially painful, but necessary. Because sometimes, to move forward, you first have to look back and make peace with what was. The cafe chosen for the meeting was on Fifth Avenue, a place bustling and public enough for Patricia to feel safe. It was a Wednesday afternoon, and the establishment was filled with the typical post-lunch buzz. Edward and Patricia arrived 15 minutes early, choosing a table in the corner from where they could see the entrance. Patricia was visibly nervous. She constantly fidgeted with her napkin, adjusted her hair, and glanced at her watch every minute. Edward held her hand across the table and said he was there, that she wasn't alone, that they could leave at any moment if she wanted. Patricia thanked him with a faint smile, but they both knew she had to do this. She needed to look into the eyes of the man who was her biological brother, the man who was obsessed with her mother, the man who had, in so many ways, influenced their lives without their knowledge. Albert Peterson arrived exactly on time. Edward recognized him immediately, even though years had passed since he'd last seen him. Albert was in his early 60s, but he was still an imposing man. Tall, with completely white hair, well-dressed in a dark suit and tie. He had light, almost transparent eyes. That scanned the cafe until they found Patricia. When their gazes met, Albert hesitated for a moment, and Edward saw something in his eyes. Regret, perhaps, or guilt. Albert approached the table slowly, as if afraid they would run. He stopped a few feet away and said in a surprisingly soft voice that he appreciated them agreeing to meet. Edward just gave a cold nod, but Patricia spoke, her voice firmer than she expected. She told Albert to sit down, that they had a lot to talk about. Albert sat, ordered a coffee from a passing waiter, and then fell, silent for a moment, seeming to choose his words carefully. Finally, he began to speak. He said he knew they had no reason to trust him or even listen to him. He knew he had done terrible things in the past, driven by obsession and selfishness. But he wanted them to know that he had changed, that he had spent the last few years trying to be a better person. Edward cut him off, saying that words were easy, that anyone could say they'd changed. He wanted to know what Albert really wanted. Why had he returned to the States? Why did he want to see Patricia now after so many years? Albert looked directly at Edward and said that he was sick. He had cancer, advanced stage. The doctors gave him maybe 2 years with aggressive treatment, maybe less. The silence that followed was heavy. Patricia looked at Albert with a complex expression. She didn't feel compassion, not yet, but she also didn't feel the anger she expected. She just saw an old, sick man, someone who was clearly at the end of his journey. Albert continued, saying that when he received the diagnosis, he began to rethink his life, all the choices he had made, all the people he had hurt. He said that during his obsession with Maria, he had done things he was deeply ashamed of. He had offered that money to Joe not out of kindness, but in the hope that a grateful Maria would turn her attention to him. When that didn't happen, when she got even sicker and then passed away, he was devastated. But it wasn't a pure devastation. It was mixed with anger, with resentment, with the feeling that the world owed him something. Albert then looked at Patricia and said something that took her completely by surprise. He said he had always known she existed, that he knew Maria had had a daughter and given her up for adoption. Maria had told him years ago when they were young, in a moment of vulnerability. She had made Albert promise never to tell anyone, especially not Patricia's adoptive parents. Albert had kept that promise for decades, But recently, when he began to investigate his own past, preparing for the approaching end, Albert discovered that the family who had adopted Maria's daughter was the very family of his younger sister, Patricia. Or, rather, the girl he thought was his younger sister was in fact Maria's daughter. The discovery shocked him deeply. It meant he had a niece, someone of his own blood, someone he had ignored his entire life. Patricia was stunned. She asked why Albert had never said anything, why he let her grow up without knowing the truth. Albert said he had been a coward, that he was afraid of opening that Pandora's box, afraid of being rejected. He said that Patricia's parents, his own parents, had adopted the girl without his knowledge, keeping it a secret from him as, well, they knew of Albert's obsession with Maria and didn't want him to have any contact with her daughter. Edward asked how Albert had found out about the DNA tests between Patricia and Isabella. Albert admitted he had hired private investigators. When he returned to the States, he wanted to find any trace of Maria that still existed. He found out about Joe, about Isabella, and then discovered the connection to Patricia. He said he wasn't proud of the methods he used, but he needed to know the truth before he died. Patricia finally spoke, her voice thick with emotion. She said she didn't know what to feel, that she was processing too much information at once. She said Albert had no right to investigate her life, to invade her privacy, but at the same time she understood that he was trying to make peace with the past before it was too late. She asked what he wanted from her, what his expectations were. Albert said he didn't expect forgiveness, that he didn't even expect a relationship. He just wanted Patricia to know the full truth, to know her story. He said he had documents, photos, letters that Maria had written to him over the years before she met Joe. He wanted to give all of it to Patricia so she could get to know the mother she never had the chance to know personally. He also said he had a proposal. Albert was a rich man, very rich. He had made a fortune abroad with investments and business. He had no children, no close family besides Patricia. He wanted to leave part of his fortune to her and also to Isabella. He saw it as a way to atone for his past mistakes, to do something good with the money he had accumulated. Edward immediately rejected the idea. He said that neither Patricia nor Isabella needed Albert's money, that it sounded like an attempt to buy forgiveness. Albert shook his head, saying he understood the mistrust. But that wasn't it. He simply wanted to do something useful with his fortune before he died. If they didn't want it for themselves, he suggested they use it to expand Patricia's non-profit, to help more low-income families access medical treatment. It would be a way to honor the memory of Maria, who had always been a generous and caring woman. Patricia fell, silent, thinking. She looked at Edward, seeking guidance. Edward said the decision was hers, that he would support her, no matter what she chose. Patricia then looked at Albert and said she needed time to think. She said she wasn't closing the door completely, but she wasn't making any promises either. She wanted to see the documents, the photos, the letters. She wanted to get to know Maria better through Albert's eyes. But as for the money, she would need to discuss it with her family, especially with Isabella. Albert agreed, saying that was more than fair. He said he would send the documents through his lawyer, that he would respect Patricia's time and space. He then stood up, ready to leave. But before he left, he looked at Patricia with teary eyes and said that she looked a lot like Maria. Not physically, but in her essence, in the way she spoke, in the strength she conveyed. He said Maria would be proud of the woman Patricia had become. Patricia felt a lump in her throat. She didn't reply, just nodded. Albert left the cafe, and Edward and Patricia sat there in silence for long minutes. The buzz of the cafe around them seemed distant, unreal. Patricia finally spoke, saying she didn't know what to think of Albert. He seemed genuinely remorseful, but it was hard to forget everything he had done, the pain he had caused. Edward said they didn't need to make any immediate decisions. They could wait to see the documents, talk with Isabella, Joe, and Raphael, and then decide together how to proceed. Patricia agreed, and they left the cafe holding hands, both thoughtful, both carrying the weight of more revelations. That night there was another family meeting at the mansion. Patricia and Edward told them about the meeting with Albert, about everything he had revealed. The reaction was mixed. Joe was furious, saying Albert didn't deserve a second of their attention, that he had manipulated Maria and was now trying to manipulate Patricia. Isabella was more contemplative, saying she understood Joe's anger, but she also saw value in learning more about her mother through the letters and photos. Raphael surprised everyone by saying he thought they should accept Albert's proposal about the money for the non-profit. Not for the money itself, but for what it represented. It was a chance to turn something negative into something positive, to use resources to do good, to help people who really needed it. He said Maria would probably approve, that she had always been a generous woman. Patricia considered her son's words and realized he was right. She looked at Isabella and asked what she thought. Isabella said that if the money was used to help other people, especially sick children like she once was, then she fully supported it. She didn't want anything for herself, but she wanted Albert's legacy to be positive, not negative. Joe was still reluctant, but when he saw that both Isabella and Patricia were inclined to accept, he relented. He said he trusted their judgment, that if they thought it was the right thing to do, he wouldn't object. Edward said he would handle all the legal aspects, ensuring the money was used exactly as promised, without any interference from Albert. The documents arrived 2 days later, a large box filled with papers, photos, and letters. Patricia and Isabella sat together in the mansion's living room and began to explore the contents. There were photos of a young Maria, still a teenager, smiling at the camera with that smile Isabella vaguely remembered. There were letters Maria had written to Albert, letters of a friendship she thought was pure, unaware of his true intentions. There was also a diary. A diary Maria kept during her pregnancy with Patricia, before giving the baby up for adoption. Patricia read that diary with tears streaming down her face. Maria wrote about her pain, her confusion, her love for the daughter she carried but knew she couldn't raise. She wrote about the pressure from her family, about the stigma of being a single mother, about the impossible decision she had to make. Isabella held Patricia's hand. As she read, both of them crying together for the woman who united them, for the mother who loved them both even if in different ways. At the end of the diary, there was a letter Maria had written to the daughter she gave up for adoption, a letter that was never delivered. In it, Maria said she loved that baby more than anything in the world, that she was making this decision because she wanted to give her a better life than she could offer. Maria wrote that she hoped her daughter would be happy, would have everything she deserved, would grow up knowing she was loved from the moment she was conceived. She asked for forgiveness for not being strong enough to keep her, but promised she would always carry her in her heart. The letter ended with a blessing, with wishes of love and happiness for the child she would never know. Patricia finished reading and collapsed into sobs. Isabella hugged her, and the two of them stayed there, intertwined, sharing a pain that transcended generations, a pain that could finally begin to heal. Edward, Joe, and Raphael watched from a distance, respecting that moment. Between the two sisters, that moment of deep connection with the woman they both loved, but neither could truly know. In the following days, Patricia decided to accept Albert's proposal. She spoke with lawyers, established a foundation for the non-profit that would help hundreds, perhaps thousands of families over the years. The money would be used for medical treatments, medications, surgeries, everything that underprivileged children needed to have a chance at a normal life. It would be Maria's legacy, transformed into something beautiful through Albert's belated generosity. Albert was informed of the decision and asked to see Patricia one more time. She agreed, but this time she brought Isabella with her. The three of them met again at the same cafe, and Albert thanked them profusely for accepting. He said he could now depart in peace, knowing he had done at least one thing right. Isabella, who had been silent until then, finally spoke. She told Albert that she didn't forgive him for his past mistakes, for the way he treated her mother. But she recognized that he was trying to atone, and that counted for something. She said she hoped he would find peace in whatever time he had left. Albert looked at Isabella with tears in his eyes. He said she had Maria's spirit, strong and generous even in the face of pain. He then stood up, said goodbye to them both, and left the cafe. It would be the last time they would see him. Months later, they would receive news that Albert had passed away, but this time the news didn't bring pain. It brought only a sense of closure, of a cycle completed. As the months passed, life at the Miller mansion settled into a new normal. Patricia and Isabella became increasingly close, discovering they had much in common. They worked together at the non-profit, using Albert's resources to make a real difference in people's lives. They saw children who once had no hope receive treatment, recover, and smile again. And in every child saved, they saw Maria. They saw her legacy continuing. Raphael and Isabella continued their relationship, which matured with each passing day. Raphael had graduated from high school and been accepted into a business program, following in his father's footsteps, but with his own vision. He wanted to help run the non-profit to use his knowledge for good. Isabella was finishing her degree in education, already doing internships and discovering that she truly loved working with children. One evening, 6 months after the last conversation with Albert, Raphael proposed to Isabella. They were on the same stone bench near the ornamental pond, their special place. Raphael got down on one knee, took a box from his pocket, and asked if Isabella would marry him. Isabella, crying with happiness, said yes without hesitation. The wedding was set for the following year after Isabella graduated. It would be a simple but beautiful ceremony in the mansion's garden, surrounded only by close family and friends. Edward and Patricia were radiant. Joe was proud, and everyone eagerly awaited the day that would celebrate not just the union of two people, but the union of two families that through winding and painful paths had become one. The following year passed like a gust of wind, but each day was lived intensely by everyone at the Miller mansion. Isabella dove headfirst into her final year of college, determined to graduate with honors. She spent hours in the Columbia Library, surrounded by books on pedagogy, child psychology, and inclusive education. Her thesis topic was especially meaningful to her, something that touched her heart and her history deeply. Her thesis defense took place on a March morning. Isabella was nervous, her hands trembling as she organized her presentation slides. But when she began to speak about the inclusion of children with cardiac conditions in the school environment, her voice gained firmness. She spoke with passion about the barriers these children face, about the importance of adapting physical activities, about how teachers can be agents of inclusion rather than exclusion. She shared discreetly but powerfully her own experience, and the review board was visibly moved. When the chair of the board announced that Isabella had passed with highest honors, a perfect score, and a recommendation for publication, the audience erupted in applause. Edward and Patricia were in the third row, giving a standing ovation, arm in arm. Beside them, Joe discreetly wiped away tears with the back of his hand, trying to maintain his composure but failing miserably. Raphael was in the front row, holding a huge bouquet of sunflowers, Isabella's favorite flowers, his chest puffed out with pride for the woman he loved. When Isabella came down from the stage, he hugged her tightly, whispering in her ear how proud he was, how much he loved her. The non-profit grew every day, expanding in ways no one had imagined possible. With Albert's resources, now managed by a competent team led by Patricia with Raphael as the financial director, dozens of families were helped monthly. The initial project, which started modestly, had transformed into a real movement for social change. Children who once had no hope at all now received cutting-edge treatments, complex surgeries, and imported medications that cost a fortune. Raphael had discovered a calling he never knew he had. He spent entire mornings visiting hospitals, talking with families, learning the stories behind each number, each case. He saw in every child a reflection of himself on that day at the pool, a life that deserved to be saved, and he saw in every desperate parent a reflection of Joe, someone willing to do anything for their children. There was one story in particular that had deeply marked Raphael. It was about a boy named Peter, just 5 years old, with a heart condition similar to Isabella's. Peter's parents, a humble couple from the outskirts of the city, had done everything to get their son treatment. But there simply wasn't enough money in the world to pay for the surgery he needed. When the non-profit took on Peter's case, Raphael followed it personally. He was present during the surgery, waiting for hours with the parents in the waiting room. When the surgeon came out and said everything had gone well, that Peter would live, Raphael cried along with the parents. In that moment, Raphael fully understood what his father must have felt when Joe carried an unconscious Isabella out of the pool. It was pure, intense, overwhelming gratitude. It was the profound understanding that life is precious, fragile, and that when someone gives you the chance to keep living, you carry that with you forever. With each recovery story, Patricia and Isabella felt they were honoring Maria's memory in the best possible way. They kept a photo of her at the non-profit's headquarters, a young, smiling photo full of life. Below the photo, a plaque read, "The Maria Institute for Child Health, where love becomes a cure." The wedding was set for a Saturday in October, as spring began to give way to summer in New York. The weeks leading up to the big day were a mix of anxiety and excitement. Isabella and Patricia spent entire afternoons organizing every detail, from the choice of flowers to the dinner menu. It was a special time for both of them, an opportunity to further strengthen the sisterly bond they had discovered. Patricia insisted on paying for everything, saying it was her gift to her sister. Isabella tried to protest, saying it was too much, but Patricia was firm. She said she had missed the first 19 years of Isabella's life and wanted to make up for it somehow. It wasn't about money, it was about love, about being present for the important moments. The mansion's garden was transformed into a fairy tale setting. Edward hired a team of decorators who worked for days to create the perfect atmosphere. White and pink flowers were planted especially for the occasion, creating a natural carpet of soft colors. Varnished wooden chairs with white satin cushions were arranged in semicircular rows around a makeshift altar near the ornamental pond, exactly where Raphael had proposed to Isabella. A white gazebo was erected near the pond, draped with tulle curtains and decorated with floral arrangements that looked like cascades of petals. Tiny lights, like fireflies, were hung in the garden's ancient trees, creating a magical effect that would be even more impressive when night fell. A white fabric aisle runner was stretched from the guest house, where Isabella would get ready, to the altar, flanked by candles in glass holders that would be lit minutes before the ceremony. Isabella woke up that morning with a mix of nervousness and euphoria. Her heart, the heart that had always been her weak point, was beating fast. But this time, it wasn't from fear or exhaustion. It was from pure anticipated joy. It was the day she had dreamed of, since she admitted to herself that she loved Raphael. It was the day she would stop being just Isabella Evans and become Isabella Miller, making official on paper what her heart had known for so long. She was in the small guest house she shared with Joe, the same house where they had lived for the past few years, but which she would soon leave to start a new life with Raphael. The house had been specially decorated for the day, with flowers in every corner, making the small space feel even more cozy and special. Patricia arrived early, bringing not only a team of makeup artists and hairstylists, but also a full breakfast she had prepared herself. Scrambled eggs, warm French bread, fresh fruit, fresh squeezed orange juice. She said Isabella needed to eat well, to keep her energy up, because it was going to be a long and emotional day. The two sisters had breakfast together, talking about everything and nothing, laughing nervously, enjoying these last moments before the great transformation. The beauty team arrived at 10 in the morning. First came the hair. The hairstylist worked for over an hour on Isabella's brown locks, creating soft, romantic waves that fell over her shoulders, partially pinned back with delicate clips adorned with tiny pearls. A few loose strands framed her face, softening her features and highlighting her dark, expressive eyes. Next came the makeup. The makeup artist worked delicately, enhancing Isabella's natural beauty without overdoing it. A light foundation, rosy blush, soft eyeshadow in nude and gold tones, mascara that made her lashes look even longer, and a rosy nude lipstick that perfectly matched her dress. When it was all done, when Isabella looked in the mirror, she barely recognized herself. There stood a radiant bride, ready for the most important day of her life. The wedding dress had been chosen together weeks ago. It was a simple but elegant dress of white satin with lace details, which highlighted Isabella's understated beauty. When she put it on, with Patricia's help, and looked in the mirror, she barely recognized herself. There stood a radiant woman ready to start a new phase of her life. Joe entered the room and stopped at the door, watching his daughter. He had tears in his eyes, but they were tears of pure happiness. He approached, took Isabella's hands and said she was beautiful, that Maria would be proud. Isabella hugged her father tightly, thanking him for everything, for being the best father in the world, for never giving up on her even in the toughest times. Patricia watched the scene with emotion. She thought about how strange and wonderful it was that just 2 years ago she didn't know she had a sister. And now here she was, helping Isabella get ready for her wedding to her son. Life had a curious way of intertwining destinies, of creating families where there were once only strangers. On the other side of the mansion, Raphael was also getting ready. Edward was helping him with his tie, a fatherly gesture that made Raphael smile. Father and son had grown much closer in recent years. Edward had learned to value time with his family, and Raphael had learned to admire his father, not just as a successful businessman, but as a man of character. Edward told his son he was proud of him, that Isabella was an incredible woman, and he was lucky to have her. Raphael agreed, saying he knew that every day. He said Isabella made him want to be a better person, more generous, more aware of the world around him. Edward hugged his son, and in that embrace were years of unsaid love, of understanding, of mutual respect. The guests began to arrive around 4 in the afternoon. There were few, just close family and intimate friends. Some of Isabella's college classmates, some of Raphael's high school friends, old employees of the mansion who had followed the story from the beginning. Everyone settled into the decorated chairs, a lively buzz filling the air. At 5 o'clock, the music began. It was a soft violin melody played live by a string quartet. Raphael walked to the altar, accompanied by Edward. He was nervous, his hands sweating, his heart pounding. But when the music changed, announcing the bride's entrance, and he turned to see her, all his nervousness vanished. Isabella walked slowly down the aisle formed by the chairs, her arm linked with Joe's. Her father led her with steady steps but with teary eyes. Isabella looked only at Raphael, and in his green eyes she saw everything she needed to know. Unconditional love, the promise of a future, the certainty that they had made the right choice. When they reached the altar, Joe placed Isabella's hand in Raphael's, and in that simple gesture there was a symbolic transfer. Joe was entrusting his daughter, his most precious treasure, to the care of this young man who had grown up with her. Raphael squeezed Isabella's hand and murmured a thank you to Joe, who just nodded, too emotional to speak. The ceremony was officiated by a celebrant Edward had hired. The words were beautiful, speaking of love, companionship, building a life together. But Isabella and Raphael barely heard them. They were lost in each other's eyes in the moment, in the perfection of that instant. When it was time for the vows, Raphael was the first to speak. He said in a clear but emotional voice that he had met Isabella when he was just 7 years old, and that she had saved his life that day at the pool. But he said that wasn't the only day she had saved him. She saved him every day with her kindness, her strength, her ability to see the good in people. He promised to love her every day of his life, in good times and bad, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer. He promised to be her partner, her best friend, her safe harbor. Isabella, now crying openly, began her vows. She said she never imagined she would be loved like this, so completely, so intensely. She said Raphael made her feel seen, valued, important. That with him, she wasn't the sick girl, the groundskeeper's daughter, the outsider. With him, she was just Isabella, and that was more than enough. She promised to love him with all the strength of her fragile but courageous heart. She promised to build a beautiful life beside him, full of purpose, love, and meaning. The celebrant asked for the rings. Patricia was holding them, and she handed them over with trembling hands. Raphael placed the ring on Isabella's finger, and she placed his on his, and when the celebrant declared them husband and wife, they kissed under the enthusiastic applause of the guests. It was a long kiss, sealed with tears of happiness, a kiss that marked the beginning of a new journey. The party that followed was intimate and joyful. Tables were set up in the garden, decorated with flowers and candles. The food was delicious, prepared by a caterer Patricia had personally chosen. Live music played softly in the background, creating a magical atmosphere. People talked, laughed, and toasted the newlyweds. There was a sense of completeness in the air, as if everyone there knew they were witnessing something special, something rare. During dinner, Edward asked to speak. He stood up, champagne glass in hand, and began. He said that when Isabella saved Raphael so many years ago, he never imagined that girl would become such an integral part of his family. He said Isabella had taught them all valuable lessons about courage, about overcoming limitations, about the true strength of the human spirit. He said it was an honor to have her as a daughter-in-law, and that he knew Raphael had chosen well. Patricia also spoke. She said that 2 years ago, when she found out Isabella was her sister, her world turned upside down, but it was the best thing that could have happened. She said finding Isabella was like finding a part of herself that had been missing, and now seeing her sister marry her son was a moment of pure joy. She toasted the newlyweds, wishing them all the happiness in the world. Joe was the last to speak. He was nervous, not used to public speaking, but when he took the microphone, the words came from the heart. He said he had raised Isabella alone, with very little but with a lot of love. He said he had watched her fight against illness, against limitations, against a world that was often cruel to those who were different. But she never gave up, never lost her kindness, never stopped believing that better days would come. He said he was immensely proud of her, and that he knew Maria, wherever she was proud too. He finished by saying that Raphael was a lucky man, but that he also knew Raphael was worthy of Isabella, that he would take good care of her, and that was all a father could ask for. The night went on with dancing, laughter, and stories. Isabella danced with Joe, a slow, emotional waltz that made almost everyone present cry. Raphael danced with Patricia, thanking her for everything she had done, not just for that day, but for everything she had done for Isabella over the years. Edward and Patricia danced together, silently renewing their own vows, remembering why they had fallen in love so many years ago. When the party finally ended, it was well past midnight. The guests left one by one, leaving messages of affection and wishes for happiness. Isabella and Raphael stayed in the garden, alone, watching the lights in the trees. Raphael hugged Isabella from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder, and whispered that he was happy, so happy it hurt. Isabella smiled, leaning back against him, feeling complete in a way she never thought possible. They had decided not to go on a honeymoon right away. They just wanted a few days together, in the new home they had prepared on the mansion's property, a small but cozy house where they would build their life. The honeymoon would come later, when Isabella was completely free from college commitments and Raphael could take a vacation from his work at the non-profit. The following months were a time of adjustment and discovery. Isabella began working as a teacher at a private school that served children with special needs. It was a challenging but extremely rewarding job. She saw a version of herself in every child, and she did everything in her power to ensure they felt seen, valued, and capable. Raphael continued at the non-profit, working side by side with Patricia. They had expanded their operations, now serving not only New York City, but also towns upstate. Hundreds of families benefited, and each success story was celebrated. Raphael discovered he had found his calling, that helping others brought him a satisfaction that no traditional business ever could. Edward gradually began to pass more responsibilities at the construction company to trusted managers. He wanted more time for his family, to travel with Patricia, to enjoy the life they had built together. He realized he had spent years chasing professional success, but that true success was at home, with the people he loved. Joe, now 60, began to think about retirement. Edward had offered a generous pension, ensuring he could live comfortably for the rest of his life. But Joe wasn't ready to stop completely yet. He liked to work, to keep things in order, to have a purpose. So he continued, but at a slower pace, finally allowing himself to rest now and then. A year after the wedding, Isabella discovered she was pregnant. The discovery happened on an ordinary Tuesday morning. She had woken up feeling nauseous, something that had been happening for a few days, and decided to take a test. When the two lines appeared on the display, confirming the pregnancy, Isabella stood still for long minutes, just staring at that piece of plastic that changed everything. She was happy, immensely happy, but also terrified. Her heart condition had always been a concern, and she knew from previous conversations with her doctors that a pregnancy would be considered high risk. But there she was, pregnant, with a life growing inside her. A life that was hers and Raphael's, the fruit of the love that had united them against all odds. When Raphael came home from work, that night, Isabella was sitting in the living room, the pregnancy test in her hand, tears streaming down her face. Raphael panicked for a second, thinking something was wrong, but when Isabella held out the test to him and said, "We're going to be parents," Raphael's world literally stopped. He looked at the test, looked at Isabella, and then scooped her up in his arms, spinning her around the room, laughing and crying at the same time. The news was met with a mix of joy and concern by the family. Edward and Patricia were ecstatic, but immediately contacted the best doctors in New York. Joe cried when he learned he was going to be a grandfather, but he was also worried about Isabella's health. Meetings with cardiologists and obstetricians were scheduled, and a detailed monitoring plan was established. The doctors were clear and direct. The pregnancy would be high risk, very high risk. There would be a need for constant monitoring, weekly appointments, frequent tests, rest when necessary, and special care. They didn't hide the fact that there were risks, for both Isabella and the baby, but they also said that with proper care, the chances of a successful pregnancy were good. Isabella was scared, more scared than she had ever been in her life, but she was also determined. She wanted this baby more than anything. She wanted to give Raphael the child he deserved, to give Joe a grandchild, to give Patricia and Edward the joy of being grandparents. And more than anything, she wanted to be a mother, to experience the unconditional love her own father had given her her whole life. The pregnancy was, indeed, very difficult. The first 3 months were marked by constant nausea, extreme fatigue, and several trips to the emergency room as a precaution. Isabella had to take an absurd amount of medication every day, balancing the baby's needs with maintaining her own cardiac health. There were moments when she thought she couldn't do it, moments when fear almost consumed her. In the 4th month, she had a serious scare. One morning, she woke up with her heart beating irregularly, an arrhythmia that left her dizzy and breathless. Raphael rushed her to the hospital, where she was admitted for a full week. The doctors adjusted her medications, monitored the baby constantly, and thank God both she and the baby came out of that episode fine. But it was the preventative hospital stays that wore Isabella down emotionally. In the 7th month, the doctors decided she should be on absolute bed rest. Raphael took a leave of absence from work to care for her. He was by her side 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. He prepared her meals, helped her bathe, read to her before bed, talked to her belly, and sang lullabies to the baby who was yet to come. Patricia visited every day, bringing magazines, books, and stories from the non-profit to distract Isabella. Joe came every night, after work, sat by his daughter's bed, and held her hand, often without saying a word, just being present. Edward came too, always bringing some silly gift to brighten Isabella's day. In the 8th month, the doctors began to prepare for a possible premature birth. They explained that depending on how Isabella's heart responded in the coming weeks, it might be safer to deliver the baby early. Isabella agreed, trusting completely in the professionals who were caring for her. It was in the early hours of a May morning, 3 weeks before her due date, that it all began. Isabella woke up with contractions. They weren't the false contractions she had experienced a few times in the preceding weeks. These were real, painful, and increasingly frequent. Raphael woke up to her groans and immediately called the hospital. An ambulance was dispatched, and within minutes Isabella was on her way to the operating room. The delivery was by C-section, a decision made by the doctors to minimize stress on Isabella's heart. Raphael was in the operating room, dressed in sterile scrubs, holding Isabella's hand throughout the procedure. She was awake, protected only by an epidural, and could hear everything. When the Baby's cry echoed through the room, a strong, healthy cry Isabella and Raphael cried together. It was a girl, a perfect little girl, with a good weight for her gestational age, crying loudly, moving her tiny arms and legs. The nurse brought her close to Isabella, who saw her for the first time through the tears blurring her vision. The baby had dark hair, pink skin, and when she opened her eyes for the first time, Isabella saw something in that gaze that made her instantly forget all the pain, all the fear, all the struggle of the past 9 months. They named her Maria, in honor of the woman who had united all their lives in such unexpected and profound ways. Maria Evans Miller, a name that carried the history of 2 families, of 2 strong women, of a legacy of love and overcoming adversity. When Isabella held Maria in her arms for the first time, she felt a connection that transcended everything. She looked at that tiny, perfect face and promised she would give her everything she herself had received and more. Unconditional love, opportunities, the chance to be whoever she wanted to be. Raphael looked at his wife and daughter with tears streaming down his face. He thought about how incredible life was, how one day at the pool so many years ago had changed everything. If Isabella hadn't jumped into the water that day, he wouldn't be here. And if he weren't here, this beautiful child wouldn't exist. It was a chain of events, each one necessary, each one precious. Patricia entered the hospital room and saw her granddaughter for the first time. She held Maria carefully, marveling at this new life. She looked at Isabella and said the girl had Maria's eyes, the first Maria, their mother. Isabella smiled, tired but radiant, and said she hoped her daughter would inherit not just the eyes, but also the generous heart of the grandmother she would never know. Edward and Joe arrived shortly after, both eager to meet little Maria. Joe held his granddaughter with trembling hands, and in that moment he felt the cycle was complete. His wife Maria was gone, but her legacy continued, not just through Isabella and Patricia, but now through this child who would carry her name and, hopefully, her spirit. The following years were ones of growth and happiness for the entire Miller family. Little Maria grew up healthy and strong, defying all odds. She was a cheerful and curious child who charmed everyone around her. With dark brown hair like Isabella's and the piercing green eyes of Raphael, she was the perfect combination of her parents. But more than looks, Maria inherited something far more precious: the kindness of the grandmother she never knew, the courage of her mother, and the gentleness of her father. Isabella recovered well from the birth, although the doctors recommended she wait at least 3 years before thinking about having another child. But motherhood transformed Isabella in a way she never imagined possible. She discovered reserves of love she didn't know she had, a capacity for complete self-giving that surprised her. She returned to work when Maria turned 1, but now on a part-time basis. The school where she taught was understanding, allowing her to work only half days. Mornings were dedicated to Maria, playing in the park, reading children's stories, singing lullabies. Afternoons were at school, where Isabella became one of the most beloved teachers, known for her special care for children with special needs. Raphael continued at the non-profit, but now with even more purpose. Being a father had changed his perspective on everything. Every child the non-profit helped, he saw as if they were his own daughter. The work ceased to be just a job and became a life mission. He and Patricia expanded operations beyond New York City, opening branches in other cities. The Maria Institute for Child Health was saving hundreds of lives a year. When Maria turned 3 and the doctors gave the green light, Isabella became pregnant again. This time, the process was a little less tense, though still surrounded by care. She knew what to expect, knew her body better, and was more emotionally prepared. And 9 months later, Lucas was born, a boy with chubby cheeks and an easy smile who brought even more joy to the house. 2 years after Lucas came Sophia, completing the family. 3 children, 3 blessings, 3 living proofs that Isabella had overcome every limitation that once tried to define her life. The doctor said it was a miracle, that very few women with her condition managed to have 3 successful pregnancies. But Isabella knew it wasn't just a miracle. It was love, it was support, it was an entire family holding her up during the storms. Edward and Patricia became devoted grandparents. Edward, the serious and always busy businessman, completely melted in the presence of his grandchildren. He took them for walks in the park, bought them too many toys, and spoiled them in every possible way. Patricia taught Maria old family recipes, read stories to Lucas, and sang lullabies to Sophia. She saw in each grandchild a second chance, an opportunity to experience parenthood in a way she hadn't with her own son, always so busy with social obligations. Edward also began to slow down in business. Gradually, he passed more responsibilities at the development company to trusted managers, people he had trained over the years. He wanted more time for his family, to travel with Patricia, to enjoy the life they had built together. They took incredible trips through Europe, saw places they had only seen in magazines, but always returned home eager, missing their grandchildren. One of the most special trips was when Edward and Patricia took the whole family to the Hamptons. They rented a huge house with a view of the ocean and spent 2 weeks all together. It was magical to see the children playing in the sand, building castles, running from the waves. Isabella, sitting on the porch with Raphael, watched it all and felt a gratitude so deep it sometimes physically hurt. Joe retired when he turned 65. Edward insisted on organizing a farewell party, inviting everyone who worked or had worked at the mansion over the years. It was an emotional celebration, with speeches about Joe's dedication, about how he was more than an employee, he was family. Edward announced that Joe would receive a generous lifelong pension, ensuring he could live comfortably for the rest of his life. But Joe wasn't one to sit still. Retired from formal work, he dedicated himself to being a full-time grandfather. He picked up the kids from school when Isabella and Raphael couldn't, took them for ice cream, and taught them how to plant flowers in the garden. Maria, Lucas, and Sophia adored Grandpa Joe, who had endless stories to tell and infinite patience to listen to theirs. The guest house that Joe and Isabella had occupied for so many years was renovated and turned into a small community center. Isabella had the idea and Edward loved it. The space now offered free tutoring for local children, art workshops, and even free psychological counseling. It was another way of giving back, of transforming a place that had meant so much to them into something that benefited others. On a summer afternoon, exactly 20 years after that fateful day at the pool, the entire family was gathered in the mansion's garden for a barbecue. It was a hot Saturday, with a clear blue sky, not a single cloud in sight. Edward was in charge of the grill, wearing a ridiculous apron Raphael had given him for his birthday, covered in jokes about being the world's best grill master. Patricia was at the outdoor table, arranging salads and side dishes, with the help of Maria, who at 10 already loved to cook. Lucas, 8, was playing catch with Joe on the lawn, while Sophia, 6, chased butterflies among the flowers. It was a scene of absolute peace, of simple but profound happiness. Isabella and Raphael were preparing drinks in the mansion's kitchen, but paused for a moment to look out the window. They watched the scene outside, Raphael's father at the grill, his mother with their daughter, her father playing with their son, and everything seemed so perfect, so right, so exactly as it should be. Raphael hugged Isabella from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder, and said he couldn't imagine his life without her, without this whole family they had built together. Isabella leaned back against him and agreed, saying that sometimes she still had to pinch herself to believe it was all real, that she had truly achieved all of this. Isabella was sitting on the stone bench near the ornamental pond, the same place where Raphael had proposed to her years ago. She watched the scene before her, her heart, the heart that had almost killed her so many times, overflowing with gratitude. She thought about everything that had happened, about the entire journey she had traveled to get here. Raphael sat down beside her and asked what she was thinking about. Isabella smiled and said she was thinking about how grateful she was. Grateful for having jumped into the pool that day, even knowing she might not survive. Grateful for being saved by Joe. Grateful for being welcomed by the Miller family. Grateful for discovering she had a sister. Grateful for allowing herself to love Raphael. Grateful for every moment, every challenge, every victory. Raphael pulled her close and kissed her softly. He said he was the grateful one, that she had saved not just his life that day, but his soul every day since. She had shown him what truly mattered, had given his existence purpose. They sat there, watching the family they had built, the life they had created, and amidst the noise of the children playing, the laughter of the adults, the sun setting over the city, they knew with absolute certainty that they had found what everyone searches for, but few find. True love, true family, true happiness, the story of Isabella and Raphael, which began with an act of courage on a hot summer day, had transformed into a legacy of love, resilience, and hope. It was a story that would be told to their grandchildren and great-grandchildren, a story that proved that sometimes the greatest challenges lead to the greatest blessings. It was a story of two souls who were made for each other, who crossed the impossible to find one another, and who built a life together that was worth every tear, every struggle, every moment of doubt. And as the sun set over the garden of the Greenwich mansion, casting golden hues, over everyone gathered there a sense of peace hung in the air, the peace of knowing that no matter what the future held, they would face it together, as a family, as one.